What is up, Lucky Tackle Box community? Travis here, and today we're going over the bass fishing basics. That's our new motto here at Lucky Tackle Box, where we want to make sure we keep you guys informed at the basic level so that nothing goes over your head, so you don't learn a new technique and have no idea how to rig it up or really just the fundamentals of it. So today we're going over the three most common setups. That's going to be a Texas rig, a drop shot, and then a wacky rig. And I'm going to talk about the advantages to using each one of those rigs. I'm going to show you exactly how to set it up. And then I'm going to talk about some key accessories you can use with that. And then some more advanced tips that you can start thinking about adding in. So hopefully you guys are going to follow along. We've got Kate right now working the graphics and putting together the live feed from the Lucky Tackle Box team. And then we've got Rachel in the comments on YouTube and on Facebook. So make sure you say hello to Rachel and then ask her any questions. She's going to relay them to me because they're also on a call with me right now that they can pass along any kind of comments or questions that you guys have. Once again, the whole idea of Lucky Tackle Box is getting you guys baits and the accessories from the hooks, the weights, the line, and any tools that you need to go out and fish these new techniques. But then we come here on the content, whether it's live or the different videos that I go out and make that help you actually understand what those baits are supposed to be doing and give you confidence to go out and fish them yourself and fish them in the right situations to catch more fish. So anyway, guys, let's move right into it. Our first rig is the Texas rig. And let's go over a little clarification real quick. And this is really not that important, but it's worth noting for you guys that are learning and stuff. The Texas rig really refers to rigging up the bait weedless. And so you can see as that bait comes through the water, it's able to, you're able to work it on the bottom. You're able to work it through little brush piles, through little grass and things like that. And if you don't have the weight pegged against the bait, which we'll talk about in just a second, that bait will fall down kind of slowly. As you hop it, it falls down, has like a slow little fall to the bottom or the last few inches. So that gives that bass it makes it look a little more natural, and it gives that bass a little time to react. All right, so now let's talk about setting this bait up. Texas rig to everyone means a little bullet weight right here and a weedless rigged hook. And there's a couple different hooks we can do for that. But when in actuality, a Texas rig really refers to rigging it weedless. So you actually put the hook through the head of the bait. So what you would do is you actually come through the head of the bait right there, and then you about 1/4 of an inch down, and then you turn it around and you go back into the bait, stick that hook through the other side, and then you just skin hook it. You just take that little tip and you bury it back into the worm, and there you go. Now, what most people say are referring to when they say I was using a Texas rig is they actually have a weight as well, a little bullet weight right here. But just so you guys know, a Texas rig really means just how it's rigged, weedless like that. But today we're talking about the full Texas rig, which has got a bullet weight also. And this is anywhere from a 3/16 to a 1/4 ounce to get you started. You can go a lot bigger, which we'll talk about in just a second. And then a bobber stop or a toothpick. And the reason you will use this is so when the video you watched before, when you hop this bait off the bottom, the weight drops down and then the bait slowly falls down as well. And you hop it, the weight drops down and that bait slowly falls down again. And but if you peg this thing with a little bobber stop, you peg it, now the weight can't slide free. This is used when you're going to fish some kind of cover, or you're trying to punch through cover, or you're trying to work in and out of tree limbs or something down there, so that when you're feeling this bait come over some little tree limbs down at the bottom, as this bait comes over, you don't want the weight to fall through and not the bait. And so if you're on some limbs, you don't want it to be like this. You want it to go, because the fish are going to be tucked up in those limbs. So as you pull this bait over and it's pegged, when the weight falls over, it'll pull the bait with it, and you'll be able to fish each one of those limbs going down between there. That's why you peg them. If you don't have a bobber stop, you can also use a toothpick, and you jam it into the bullet weight, into the hole there, until it's snug, and then you just break it off. And that's a little easier way to do that. And then another feature, so with accessories with the Texas rig, there's a couple things. First is the weights you're using. I like using a tungsten weight. You feel it more. So you can feel if there's rock bottom. You can feel if you're going over limbs. You have a lot more contact with that bait. Then the bobber stops or toothpicks are very important to have with you at all times. And then you can throw in a bead. They sell little glass beads. And this is if you have water that's, about a foot or less visibility. That little bead you throw in there that weight will clank against that bead, and it's going to add a little bit more sound to it. So the bass can hear that clicking sound, and they'll key in a little bit more. When you have dingier water, the fish are not as visually hunting rather than feeling it with their lateral line, feeling that bait, displacing water, or hearing the sounds coming off there. So that little clicking noise can really be an added little factor when fishing some dingier water. Then another thing is the hooks that you use for a Texas rig. There's basically two general different common ways or common hooks to use. The first one is a offset shank worm hook. And that's going to be that more skinnier one on the left-hand side of the screen you're seeing. That's right next to that skinny worm, and that is more slender. That's going to get great hookup ratio when you're using thinner worms. But when you're using thicker plastic, when you're using some of these creature baits where there is a lot more appendages, a lot more plastic. You don't want one of those worm hooks. You want an extra wide gap. That's that bigger bow in that hook. So there's more gap for that hook to go through. There's more hook to go through that bait, so that it's not going to get caught up in the plastic as easily. So you're going to get better hookup ratios. So you want that extra wide gap, or what a lot of companies call it EWG, extra wide gap hook, for those bigger plastics, that offset worm hook for the skinnier, just the straight worms style baits. Now, yes. Brian, is a split shot weight okay to use? Absolutely. The bullet weight is going to come through stuff easier just by its design. Kate, if you can bring back up those accessories. If you look at a bullet weight, it's shaped like a bullet. So as you're coming through little things down there, if you want to get down and cover it, that thing's going to slide around and dig into that stuff easier, where a bullet weight gets caught up a lot more. Where a split shot gets caught up a lot more, especially a split shot that has the little tag end, right, where you can open it with. That's going to get caught up on a lot more things, even caught up on, any of that little algae and the gunk down there. So that's going to be a little bit of your disadvantage using a split shot. But if that doesn't seem to be a factor, go ahead, use the split shot weight. That will still get the job done. Now let's talk, and that's a great question, Brian. Thank you. Now let's talk about an advanced part of that. The example I was using is a 3/16 ounce to quarter ounce little weight. This is smaller little stuff. You can use with a spinning rod. This is very, very versatile stuff. But then you can really step up your setup, and you can go from you go to like a 5/8 all the way up to a 2 ounce tungsten weight. You can use a 3/0 punch and hook. And you can really fish some of this nastier conditions. And I can't figure out where my tungsten weight went, but I've got a picture. Oh, there you go. And you can see on the video right now, when you use a heavier weight, basically you're just bulking up your entire setup. You're using a heavier weight. You're using a bigger hook. You need to use a lot heavier line, 20-pound fluorocarbon. I use 50-pound braid most of the time if the water's not too clear. And what that allows you to do is get through that different vegetation or thick, nasty stuff that's on the top of the water. When you see a bunch of gunk pile is what we call it, up in a corner of a lake or something where it just looks like a bunch of trash, because there may be soda cans, beer cans and stuff floating in it. Bass love being underneath that. It gives them cover up shallow, but also all that old wood, the driftwood and stuff that's there heats up. That sun heats it up, and that creates a blanket for those fish. So if you have a nice big setup, you can throw that right up on there and shake it down shake it down in there and catch some big fish doing that. So when people talk about a Texas rig, a lot of times they're talking about that lighter setup. When they're talking about beefing it up and throwing a bigger setup, that's more, they're calling punching, flipping. That's going to be more of that terminology, but it's still a Texas rig setup when you're fishing it in that big vegetation and stuff as well. And I think I have a picture of that, that beefier Texas rig. I think it's the Texas Rig Advanced tip. And you can see it's just a bulkier setup right there. You can see that big weight. It's just a bigger hook. And then you're using some kind of creature bait as well, a little cross style bait that can mimic the crawdads that are down there, the bluegill, whatever that may be. So, and then Rachel, feel free to chime in with more questions as they come through. Now, guys, we're going to move now. Okay, Matthew asked what size bullet weight, and the most common for just using a Texas rig, 3/16 ounce to 1/4 ounce. You can even go up to a 3/8 ounce if you're fishing around a lot of cover and stuff, but really 3/16 would be my recommendation. That's going to get you able to fish not a lot of different gear and a lot of different situations. When you're going to that bigger, thicker cover and stuff, I'm going to say a 1/2 ounce to 3/4 ounce at least, but you've got to have a heavier rod. You've got to have thicker line. You've really got to have an entirely different setup. So don't think that you can just add a 1 ounce weight and start fishing the same things you were doing. If your line's not heavy enough, you're going to run into problems. If your rod's not heavy enough, you're going to run into problems. So good question. Thanks, Matthew. All right. Now into a drop shot. Guys, out west, this is a very popular technique, but back east, I've found that a lot of guys are, they kind of don't know when to throw it, or they just don't have much confidence in it. Now, a drop shot rig is great because the weight is actually below your bait. So in the Texas rig, the rod goes down and you're going to have your bobber stop, your weight, and then the bait. Where this setup, your rod, anytime you're shaking the rod, you're actually shaking that bait, and you can keep your presentation in one spot. Because before, if your Texas rig, every time you lift that rod, you're moving the weight along the bottom. But with a drop shot, if I'm just moving the tip just slightly, I'm actually not moving this bait. So if I cast out and I just shake it, I can keep this bait in one place for a long period of time. I can just make it look very natural and realistic right there. And it's a very great finesse approach and this, a lot of people think it's just small bass, but you can catch huge bass doing this as long as you feel confident in where you're fishing it, because it is a technique that you kind of have to fish slow. It's for picking apart spots that you believe have a lot of fish, or really picking apart targets. Now, the other thing is the other advantage is the tag end, which refers to the end below the hook. So from your hook to your weight, that's your tag end. You want to make this anywhere from 6 to 12 inches when you're out fishing, unless there's other situations that call for difference. But what this does is, if you have like grass down on the bottom that's growing up this high, your bait will float right up above that. And so it'll look like a little bait fish or something right above the grass. The other thing is, if you have a sooty bottom, so if it's that bottom where if you just were to like step on it, it would just turn into a cloud. Well, that's what this is doing. This little weight's dredging that up. So it's stirring up a lot of it. So if you have a Texas rig down there, it could get lost in all that soot, that cloud. But this drop shot will lay on the bottom, and your drop shot worm will stay above that. So once again, it will keep it in a more obvious strike zone for these bass when needed. Now, when it for the actual drop shot, first I'm going to talk about the setup here. There's a few different hooks you can use, but you're going to tie a Palomar knot, which I guess I didn't mention too. All these rigs, I'm using a Palomar knot. So if you don't know how to tie, if you're not familiar with Palomar knot, just go online, look up how to tie a Palomar knot. That's what I tie for 99% of my knots. And it's just it's a knot that holds up. It's good enough for every application. So I have the Palomar knot tied to the hook. then all I do is figure out how long I want my tag end, and then I just hook in the little drop shot weight. And all you're gonna do is slide your line in the little hole it has, and you just wedge it up into the little into this little whatever vise it has, and it will hold it tight right there. And that's it. Very, very easy setup. I like to use anywhere from 6 to 10 pound mono or fluorocarbon. And now let's talk about the different hooks you can use, because you can rig this 3 different ways. And the first way that you're seeing it rigged, that I just had it right there, is nose hooked. And I think I've got a picture of the 3 worms lined up. It's let's see here. And so you've got nose hooked in the front, and that's actually the best way also to rig it while you're making casts and working it back to the boat, because it's kind of in line with itself. And so as you're working it, it just kind of has this little wavy action. Looks like something's moving along there. It's not going to tangle around as much. And that's what you're looking in the screen right there. That's that pink worm up top, or the Morning Dawn is actually the name of the color. Then the next one is Wacky Rigged. That is right through the middle of it. And that's still the same drop shot hook. It's a size 1 or a size 1/0 drop shot hook. And pretty much every company makes it. And when you rig it Wacky Rig like that, as you shake that bait on the bottom, you're getting double the action, right? Instead of just having one, just the tail flapping around, now you have both ends of that flapping around. So as you're shaking that rod tip, both ends are kind of waving back and forth, and you're going to get lots more action. This is what I suggest when you're fishing specific targets. So if you come up to a dock and you cast right up to a piling, let it sink down to the bottom. And as it sinks, it's got that great little both tails wiggling on the way down. But then as you lift up, it'll hop up and then let it fall back down. And you can just keep it in one spot and really get a lot of action out of it and generate those strikes. This setup is going to twist a lot more. So you're going to get line twist in your line. So you don't want to be making long casts doing this as often. Then the last setup is Texas rigged. Now that is the real definition of Texas rig, which means weedless. And so that's where you're going to use like a 2/0 or 3/0 just straight shank worm hook. And Mustad makes their little grip pin edge. And that's just a great little thing. Just rig it, drop shot in there. But once again, I'm saying it's rigged Texas rigged, but it's because that's how it's rigged, but this is for a drop shot rig. And that is used when you guys want to fish around things that can get caught up. It's weedless. So now you can throw it through a lot more grass, through around vegetation where you're just working it through there and stuff. And can be a great way to make your presentation weedless. So Rachel, do we have any questions about the drop shot? Okay. How long should the tag end be for the drop shot? 6 to 12 inches is what I recommend. And then if you have reasons, if you have bass that are suspended off the bottom and you need to do 3 feet tag end, you can do that. If you've got the vegetation that is, 2 feet off the bottom, then you can make your tag end 2 feet off the bottom. So that bait is riding just above that vegetation. But the general rule, 6 to 12 inches is what I go with, unless I need to make adjustments when I'm out on the water. So good question. Now, go ahead. Travis Kirkland with a great question. Should you use a heavy rod or a light rod? With the setup I just showed, I'm usually using 6 to 8 pound mono or fluorocarbon, and I'm doing it on a finesse spinner bait. I use Sticks fishing rods, which are, as you guys that watch this a lot know, that's my company I started with Nick. That's 6 rods to fish all the techniques. I use the finesse stick, which is the lightest rod in the setup. And the reason being is you want that bait to stay in one place while you're working it right there. And so you want to have a very finesse tip so you can be working that bait up and down without accidentally applying too much pressure where you're moving the bait or moving the weight along the bottom as well. You want to just barely be lifting that bait off the bottom, let it sink back down. You can shake it a little bit, but you don't want that weight actually moving anywhere, so you can keep this bait in the same place and get all that action out of it. Also, fish don't always hit this bait real hard. Sometimes you'll be working, all of a sudden you'll just feel something different or just the tiniest little tick. And then that's when you reel set the into it. So you want to be able to feel those very subtle bites. And that's why having a finesse rod is crucial. The other thing is when you are using tiny little hooks like this, you do not have a big hook set. What you do is you reel set, meaning you just lift up as you're reeling quickly, and that bass will pull against you and it will set it itself. These hooks are super sharp. You don't need the big hook set. Now, the reason a big hook set will go against you is these hooks. So first of all, a big hook like this, you're going to drive it right into the cartilage of the fish. You're going to get a secure hook set. But when you have these little hooks like this, they're very sharp, so they will penetrate very easily, but they only penetrate thin. They skin hook the fish a lot. They don't really get deep in there. So if you really pull hard on that first pull, you will actually pop it free of that skin. You just want to get it in there so it's secure, and then you just play that fish out. You have your drag set right, and you don't let them pull hard enough to actually rip it free. What'll happen is you'll be like, oh, Travis doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm able to set the hook all day long and nothing bad is happening. I'm able to get all my fish. Well, it actually, for smaller fish, when you set the hook, it pulls them towards you. When it's a big fish and you set the hook on these little hooks, it's not going to move as much. And the only thing it's going to give is the skin. So if you're setting the hook, it's only going to work against you when you get those bigger fish. And really that is when it matters most. So start trying to really get that reel set down. So great question on the rod selection. Now let's go to the advanced tip on the drop shot. I don't have a picture of this, I don't think, but it's called power shot. So we just talked about all the finesse stuff, everything I just talked about, throw that out the window. Now we are going heavy tackle. Where you can go a 1/2 ounce up to a 3/4 ounce drop shot weight. And most of the time what I'm throwing it on some kind of Texas rigged setup. So it's weedless. And I'm using heavy line, anywhere from 15, 20 pound fluorocarbon. And I'm using a heavier action rod for a fast action heavy rod. And what I'm doing with that is I'm flipping into into thick stuff where my tag end might only be about 6 inches long or even less, even 2 to 3 inches. And that bigger weight will pull it down, whether, it's between lily pads or into little vegetation and stuff. And you're flipping and you're fishing more aggressively with it. And then when you get bit, you actually do have to set the hook because you got a big hook and you got them in cover and stuff. You're going to have to be able to yank them out of there. So power shotting is a totally different approach to this drop shot, where drop shotting is a finesse technique. This is a little bit more of a power aggressive style of fishing. And that can be extremely effective because most people are going through and fishing that vegetation, stuff, that heavy cover, are using the big punching rig like we talked about at Texas Rigs, where you can throw the drop shot and give those fish a little different look and be able to go behind somebody and catch a whole lot more fish. When I really learned how effective this technique was when I was fishing the FLW as a co-angler. So I had to fish behind a pro, and that pro would pull right up into the vegetation and he would slowly work it with a Texas rig. So I started doing the power shot, and I was able to get fish that in the same holes, he would flip in a hole and kind of open it up with his bigger setup. And then I would use mine to get it in there and be able to catch fish at times that he wasn't able to. And so it was proof that this was a different enough look to these fish that you could catch that you could fish the same spots. So, all right, guys, now let's go over to the Wacky Rig. The Wacky Rig is, the Texas rig is a very all-around great rig that you can fish along the bottom. The drop shot is off the bottom. It's a finesse approach. You get a very realistic look out of them. And then the Wacky Rig setup is for fishing like a horizontal through the whole water column. So, with a Wacky Rig, you're really looking to get bit on the fall. If you don't get bit, you want to and you want to keep working that bait, you kind of give it some shakes, lift it back up, and let that bait fall. But everything's happening as that bait is falling down to the bottom. Both those little legs are wiggling on the way down, and this is great for throwing at the edge of weed lines, at the edge of brush that's sticking out out from the shore, or along docks, pilings, whatever it is that these fish are tucked up underneath. When you throw that bait, it'll vertically fall, and these fish will see it and they'll come out and hammer it. It looks very realistic to them, and it's a real easy setup to do. And basically all you're using is a little 2/0, 3/0 Wacky Rig hook, and you're using a you don't even need an O-ring, really. All you need is a hook, and let's see if I can get this hook out. And you just push it right through the worm, right through the middle of the worm right there, and it hangs like that, and you're good to go. And tie it with a Palomar knot. I use anywhere, once again, 6 to 10 pound mono or fluorocarbon. If you're using a bait caster, you can go a little bit higher. You can go to that 12, 15 pound line. But what that I'll do at that point is I'll actually add a little weight into that as well. If you're fishing deeper water, if there's a little bit of wind, or you're fishing a little heavier line, that you need that bait to fall a little, a little bit, that bait to be heavier so it falls better, you can add a little twist weight into that, or you can use a weighted head, which that's right there. And that'll pull that bait down a little faster. And so, because there's times when you're, and guys, you guys have used this before, you know that if you're fishing it completely weightless and you're throwing it and there's wind and stuff, the wind will grab your line and it'll create a bow, and it'll pull your little weightless Wacky Rig right along the top of the surface. You can't get down there. So adding a little weight will help it fall more effectively. Then, but what happens is if you don't have a little O-ring, when you are using it out there and you catch a fish, you'll tear through the worm and you'll lose your worm every time. So having a little O-ring like that, you can, you're going to keep your worm a lot more. Now, this is a special O-ring. The majority O-rings don't have that little extra ring on it. And so your hook actually is going to go along. If you were to hook underneath here, your hook goes along that way, and it goes parallel to the worm. And you don't want that. You want that when you're fishing a nail rig or Nico rig, not when you're fishing a Wacky Rig. So we've got this little smaller circle on this O-ring, and this is a Mustad O-ring. They make these specifically for Wacky Rigs. You just put your hook through there, and now you have it perpendicular to the worm, and that's how you want to fish this thing effectively. Now let's get that little okay. And Rach, keep relaying if we got questions, but now I will show you the advanced option here, and that is go ahead. Nancy from Facebook says, hello, and what are the best hooks for a wacky worm? There is, most companies make them. Mustad is the company that we work with the most in our box. So one of our big partners, they make a wacky hook. That looks just like this right here. And it looks like this also without the weed guard. So this has got a little bit of weed guard. So as you're going through a little vegetation and stuff, that little weed guard will help not get caught up as often. It's not completely weedless, but it still will help it not get caught up as much. And then they make one that doesn't have the weed guard. And they're called Wacky Rig hooks. So it's very easy to find, and size 1 or size 1/0 are your two best little sizes for that. Nancy, very good question. All right. So now the advanced side of this is a fun little trick for you guys. And most people do not know this. This takes a little bit of time to master and figure out. So I recommend you trying it by a dock or something like that so you can really figure this out. Normally, you're going to rig it right through the middle, right? That's what we talked about. And you can see that on the top worm there. But for this rig, we have a weighted head, and we're going to rig it far over to the left, far over to the head of this bait. And what this is going to do is it's going to apply weight on more to the head side, right? So if you cast your line out and you keep your line semi-tight, so if you were to cast to a dock right now, and the dock is on this side here, okay? So I cast along that dock and I keep my line semi-tight. As this bait sinks, it's going to restrict the movement of this head, and as it's pulling down, this tail is this side is going to flap a whole lot more, and it's actually going to make this bait swim down at an angle. So if I were to cast this out on a dock, cast it right up against that dock, this bait will swim down underneath that dock. So, and the fish are not used to a bait swimming to them on a dock that there's no other way to cast up underneath. And so this is a great way to give fish a presentation in a spot they have not seen it unless people are doing this. The other thing is what I will do is I will chartreuse that tail. You can really see it show up in that picture. So I chartreuse the tail so that this is swimming. It really highlights this little bait kicking down on the way down there and can really generate some good strikes. What else did good question. Is there a certain type of year to use a wacky rig? Yes, the fish need to be shallow. So, I know in California, we've got deep reservoirs and things. And so the fish aren't as shallow as often. This is a very shallow technique because of how long it takes the bait to sink, right? Even when you put a little weight on that, it's still slowly sinking. And if those fish are oriented to the bottom or they're out deeper water, this wacky rig is going to take you way too long. It's not going to be the efficient way to fish for those fish. So you want them when they're up shallow, when they're hanging around any kind of shallow water structure. Once again, pilings are great. You just toss right up to a bridge piling, a dock piling, and you let that bait sink down there because like say a bridge piling, those fish will suspend at different depths. That's why they love bridge pilings, because depending on the water temps and the pressure and everything, they'll move up and down throughout a day, a week, whatever. And that wacky rig will sink right by them, and you can figure out what depth zone they're at because this bait will just slowly sink by all of them. So great question. But that's actually all I've got, guys. Rachel, do we have any more questions? Okay. So none of them are for the top, right? Although, okay. So yeah, so they're mid to bottom. The Texas rig you're using on the bottom as you're crawling that thing along. The drop shot, you can actually adjust that. So you can fish a few feet off the bottom if your tag end is that long. And I use this all the time for, fishing vertically for bass. When I'm watching them on the graph and stuff, I can drop down and I'll have a long tag end so I can keep that bait right in the strike zone, right where I want it to be. But the wacky rig is actually for fishing that middle water column, because once it hits the bottom, it's done with its action and stuff. Then you lift it back up, get it back up in the water column and let it fall back down. So the wacky rig's mid water column, but then the that punch rig. So say the punch rig can actually be used towards the top. When I'm and lily pads are a great example of this. When you have the lily pads, you basically have a canopy on top of the water. And so you need a big setup to be able to break free in that. Now the bass sometimes they're down at the bottom, but you can have lily pads that are 5-6 feet high. And if you've got bait fish and stuff, you've got all kinds of little fry and all the little things that are up on the top of the water up there and moving around up there on top. These bass are going to be oriented looking up to feed. So if you punch something through and it goes way down to the bottom, you're not fishing. It's not in the fish's strike zone. So what you do is you plop it up on top and you shake it till it comes free, and you keep it right up on the top. As it comes through, you don't let any more line out, and you keep that bait shaking on top right underneath the lily pads, and those bass will come up and hit it. So there's an example of you being able to actually fish it almost on top of the water if you just use the lily pads to leverage a little bit. So these things, mainly used, actually you can use them for all water depths, depending on, that's why you want to have different setups so you can adapt to different water depths and the different cover, structure, vegetation, whatever it is. But good question. Rach? Camo Sniper, you are 15. You want to get bigger. Your biggest fish is 3.5 pounds. Just spend more time. One of the things I suggest is fish areas that people are not casting into. One of the best ways to do that is to use a Texas rig and fish a little heavier setup so that you can pitch it. You know, if you've got a big lay down tree that's going out, everyone's kind of casting towards the end of that tree. But if the big bass, they'll hear that boat coming and they'll tuck back underneath that tree to the deepest, thickest stuff. And I've seen this a million times. I scuba dive nonstop out on these lakes, and these bass, when they hear anything, they're conditioned to tuck really close up into that stuff. So if you have a setup that you can really get into the thicker cover, thicker structure and everything, then you're going to have access to some of those bigger, smarter, more conditioned fish, and you're going to start catching some bigger fish on average. Great question. All right, guys, I'm going to call it right there. That was a nice and easy little live today. I hope that you guys can adapt this to your local waterways. You know, having tools, understanding the tools that you have in your toolbox, in your tackle box, will help you look at a situation, a lake, and be able to fish all the different water columns and be able to move along the bank or offshore in your boat, whatever that may be, but be able to fish all the situations correctly. And that's why it's so important to really understand why these different setups can be used in different situations. So anyway, guys, really appreciate you guys tuning in. You feel free to ask more questions. I'll respond when I go back through the comments as well, if you guys would like. But anyway, guys, like always, no one works harder to help you fish better. I'm Travis Moran, and I will catch you out on the water.